be hearing from the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, who has the tough job of delivering the medium-term budget policy statement. We speak now to economist and research associate at the Social Policy Initiative, Duma Gqubule, about not only what to expect, but maybe essentially also, Mr. Duma Gqubule, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Take a look, because we've heard a lot about how South Africa's economy is on a drip or how it is ailing. What should we understand about South Africa's economy? How would you characterize it?
I think we're in the worst economic crisis in the post-apartheid period. Since 2007, our GDP per capita, an imperfect measure of average living standards, has declined between 2007 and 2022. It is forecast to continue declining for another 3 years. So by the end of 2025, our GDP per capita will be lower than it was in 2007. So that's the first issue, is that we have had no growth for 15 years and it's set to continue for another 3 years. The second issue, we've got this unemployment crisis. We've got an unemployment rate of 42.4%. We've got 11.9 million people who are unemployed. So according to my calculation, we need to grow the economy by 4.9% just to create jobs for the 700,000 people that I forecast will enter the labor force every year until 2030. So to make inroads into the unemployment, we have to grow at a minimum of 6%. But the problem in South Africa right now is that the two most important institutions in the economy, the central bank, the Reserve Bank, only cares about inflation, and National Treasury only cares about debt. So when the Finance Minister Godongwana speaks, he will not talk about the unemployment crisis. He will not talk about the GDP growth. He will not tell us how to get the GDP growth to a level of about 6% where we can start reducing the unemployment rate. And there is such an unfortunate situation because, quite frankly, the government has decided that they do not care about this unemployment crisis. They've decided that they are not going to solve the unemployment crisis. So that is the situation that I'm in. And I was wondering as I came here, driving here to the studio, that what is the point of me coming to talk on national TV when the government itself really has effectively decided that they're not going to talk about this unemployment crisis here.
When you say that the government is not serious about solving unemployment, maybe let's go back to these 15 years of no growth in this country. What has disallowed growth?
Well, so there was a little bit of a recovery from the global financial crisis between 2010 and 2013, when our economy grew about 3% a year. But now the austerity policies, the government cutting spending, they introduced an expenditure ceiling in 2012, so the austerity took a while to start biting. So from 2014 onwards, the GDP growth declined. You know, it collapsed. So that's basically what happened. So from 2015, and one of the biggest drivers was a drop in government consumption spending to about 1% a year, and government investment spending has declined from 2015 to 2022 by about 38% a year. So I've been talking about this public sector investment strike. Everywhere you go and you listen to the president, you listen to the finance minister, they talk about the economic recovery plan, and one of the pillars of this recovery plan is infrastructure investment. They set up a fund of 100 billion rands in 2019. In fact, the president launched the fund in 2018, a 400 billion fund, and then the Treasury cancelled it in February 2019, 100 billion rands. Every year since then, they've made an allocation to the fund, which was subsequently cancelled. So 5 years after the president announced an infrastructure fund, it's got not a cent in it. So I do not understand, Dudu, what logic there is in not investing in our country's infrastructure. Because there was a period between 2003 and 2008 when we created 3.1 million jobs, and the economy, the unemployment rate went down from 40.6% to 28.7%. The economy grew at 4.5% a year, and unemployment came crashing down. So there is a relationship between GDP growth and employment. It's called an employment multiplier. So over the past 20 years, I've calculated it at 0.9. And so when we grow at 4.5%, then the unemployment rate comes down, increases by 3.6% a year, basically. That's the basic maths of unemployment. The other maths of unemployment is that the labor force is growing at 2.4% a year. So we have to create jobs for the 700,000 people who are entering the labor force every year. So since 2008, we've created only 10 jobs for 10% of the unemployed. So 90% of the unemployed have not been getting jobs. So it's a lottery. There are no jobs in the economy.
I would like for us to maybe get into this, right? So we're hearing a lot about what the finance minister needs to do, but in terms of South Africa's policy direction that we have followed over the years, where are we taking the lead from? Because we also made to understand that we are comparing ourselves with so-called developed nations, and we are called a so-called developing nation, so taking the lead from the likes of the World Bank, etc. Yet we do not have developed world outputs, but we are expected to follow developed world policies.
You've hit the nail on the head. Some of these institutions that we've set up, like an independent central bank, inflation targeting, I think they're not fit for purpose for a country that needs to develop fast, So in a country that must develop fast, like the Asian ones, there's a coordination between monetary and fiscal policy. You don't have that artificial separation between monetary and fiscal policy. The central bank is an agent of economic development, and they work together with the treasury. But in South Africa, we've had this artificial, well, many developed countries are following this as well, rich country, institutional way of organizing our economy. But I have to say that we're an upper middle income country. If you look at the IMF, emerging economies, there's about 155 of them, according to the IMF. They've been growing since the global financial crisis at 4%, 5%, 6% a year. Now, why is South Africa not? Growth has just stopped. We're not creating jobs, so we have to. So the minister, unfortunately, he will not be saying how we're going to solve for that. And what we're going to hear in the budget at 2 o'clock is this revenue shortfall. I think everybody agrees it's about 50 billion rands. And then we're going to have an expenditure overrun. So the different views on the expenditure overrun. On the bottom side, people say 50 billion rands. And then maybe in the middle, I would say 100 billion rands. And the top end, it's about 130 billion rands. I was doing this before I came here. And then what it means in practice is that they budgeted for a budget deficit of 3.9% of GDP. And the budget deficit of 275 billion rand. So what this means in practice is that the shortfall and the overrun I think it will be about probably 130 billion rands to 180 billion rands. So that means the deficit will be between 6.1% and 6.5%. Now the reason for this is that, let's talk on the revenue side. The government doesn't take into account the damage that its austerity policies are doing on the economy, because a national budget doesn't operate like a household budget. When the government spends on its people and its infrastructure, it grows the economy, as happened between 2003 2008. When the government doesn't spend on its people and its infrastructure, the economy doesn't grow. As I said earlier on, especially since 2014, when the government stopped spending on its people and its infrastructure. So when the GDP goes down, because debt is measured as a percentage of GDP, the debt ratio goes down. So the driver of the rising debt ratio is that the cost of capital is higher than the growth rate. Now, to reduce that, we call it R minus G. So to reduce that dynamic, you need coordination between the central bank and national treasury to flip that script. So the central bank has to intervene in the bond market to bring down the cost of capital. They can actually determine the cost of capital, and then the central bank and the national treasury must work together like a symphony towards growing the economy.
In fact, to your point, we heard from the Finance Minister in Drakensberg last week saying that if the country does not cut expenditure and increase borrowing, it will be out of cash by the end of March 2024. So we're going to be coming back and speaking on the effects of all of this, especially when it comes down to ground level, you and I, what it really means for the average South African.